let's talk about another way that producers influence behavior. And that's through this legislative agenda that I spoke about at the beginning. In the mid-1970s, this organization, the American Legislative Exchange Council, was formed, ALEC. ALEC is an incubator for legislation. It serves to bring together corporate lobbyists who pay high dues to participate and business-friendly state legislators. They come together and they meet around fun events like dinners and rafting trips and trips to Disney World or Disneyland, show tickets. And when they're done, they have typically they've incubated legislation that the legislators can take back to their home states and introduce as laws to get passed. In a typical year, ALEC is responsible for about 1,000 bills being introduced in state legislatures around the country. Each year, about 200 of those pass as law. So, in the last 40 years that it's been in existence, thousands of new laws have been passed as a result of this organization's efforts. What kind of laws are we talking about? Well, for example, they're behind the voter identification laws in 34 states that have been found to unfairly target racial minorities, some of which are being challenged today in court. They're also behind a spate of laws that protect animal food producers. Now, I'd like to talk about some of these. Starting at the lower left, Gag Laws. Most people have heard about these because they're in the news a lot. These are laws that make it illegal to engage in an undercover investigation at a factory farm. So, that video that I talked about at the beginning of my talk that I sent to people and asked them to watch and provide feedback on, the making of that video is illegal in 8 states now. Now, fortunately, these laws are increasingly on the radar of the public and the legislators and the governors, thankfully, who are asked to take action on them. One of these laws just passed the legislature in North Carolina, which is a leading pork-producing state, and it was just vetoed by that state's governor, thankfully. Yeah, you can applaud that. Yeah. And I hope that increasingly we'll see these laws get defeated. Unfortunately, there's always somebody in the legislature who will introduce them. So next year, there will be another bill introduced in North Carolina, and the year after that, and the year after that. And if the governor changes, that may get signed into law. Food defamation laws. These are laws that say, if you defame a food product, you can be held civilly liable. What does it mean to defame a food product? It means 2 things. To say something that is damaging and untrue about food. So, for example, in Texas, where they have such a law, if you were to take a trip to Texas and post on your Facebook page, all of the dairy coming out of Texas is contaminated with a toxin. If the dairy industry sees its sales decline, and what you said is not true, you can be liable for food defamation under that state's defamation law. Oprah Winfrey learned about this law the hard way a few years back. She had, as a guest on her show, Howard Lyman, who is a retired former cattle rancher who is now vegan and advocates for veganism and plant-based diets and animals. They were talking about the Texas beef industry, and at one point Oprah threw up her hands and said, "You stopped me cold. I'll never eat another burger." Because of some of the facts that they were talking about, and her statement, the Texas Cattlemen's Beef Association brought a lawsuit under the Texas food defamation law against Oprah and Howard. Now, what they were saying was completely true. So they had a legitimate defense to that lawsuit, and ultimately they prevailed by showing that what they were saying was true. But it's expensive to litigate a case like that, especially where facts are at issue and you're trying to establish the truth of facts. They spent an estimated $1 million defending themselves in that lawsuit. So you can see that these laws have the potential to chill free speech. If Oprah had her show today, I doubt she would want to entangle with the Texas Beef Cattlemen's Association again. I wouldn't. Who wants to get sued and spend $1 million? Even if what you say is true, anybody can sue anybody in this country, and you got to extricate yourself. So these laws, I think, have the potential to chill free speech in this country. Cheeseburger laws that we now have in half of the states in this country, these are based on a model ALEC statute called the Common Sense Consumption Act. These laws say that a plaintiff cannot recover from a manufacturer, distributor, or retailer of food based on the theory that food caused the plaintiff to become obese or develop an obesity-related disease. The proponents of these laws have been very straightforward in saying that these laws are designed to prevent the kinds of large damages awards and settlements that the tobacco industry has been subjected to in the last several decades. As you may know, the tobacco industry in this country has paid over $400 billion to settle lawsuits brought by state Medicaid programs. Now, those lawsuits generally arose because the tobacco industry concealed information that showed that cigarette smoking and the use of other tobacco products was bad for our health. Unfortunately, if and when the information begins to emerge in the next decade or two, as I expect that it will, to show that animal foods, not only are animal foods bad for our health, but that the industry has been misleading us about their effect on our health, in half of the states in this country, we will not be able to bring lawsuits based on these cheeseburger laws that will block that litigation. I'm going to skip over customary farming exemptions and come back to it and talk about animal and ecological terrorism laws. We have these in 4 out of 5 states in this country. These laws provide that what would otherwise be a relatively innocuous crime, like trespass, theft, malicious mischief, vandalism, if the crime is directed at an animal enterprise, which includes anything involving animals, a factory farm, a restaurant, a grocery store, a zoo, an aquarium, a testing facility. If that innocuous crime is directed at an animal enterprise, the penalties are significantly higher than otherwise. The putative purpose of these laws, as expressed by the people who push to get them passed, is that we need to protect the safety of the American food system. When I was researching the book, I was really interested in learning about food terrorism cases in this country. And it turns out that we haven't really had any. The FBI has never had a food terrorism case on its list of major terrorism cases. The only 2 food terrorism cases I've found were tiny, they were local, and nobody died. To give you an example of one of them, somebody poisoned a salad bar in a restaurant in Oregon with salmonella, and a couple of people got sick. That's hardly the kind of food terrorism that threatens our food system. We have 2 million farms in this country producing food every day. There's a vast network spread over 3,000 miles of food production. It would be very difficult for a terrorist organization, even if it were incredibly well organized, to take down that system. What is actually happening here is something different. Will Potter has written a great book on this, which is called Green is the New Red. What Will Potter says is that just as the communist scare in the 50s was designed to draw attention to people's behavior if they were alleged to have communist affiliation, the Green Scare that we're living in today is designed to stifle activism among environmental and animal activists by branding them with a terrorist label. It's a very difficult label to overcome. These laws, which are also based on a model ALEC statute called the Animal and Ecological Terrorism Act, mean that if you're engaged in relatively innocuous civil disobedience or exercising free speech rights, you can be charged as a terrorist in this country. It's unbelievable. It's a very powerful weapon that animal food producers have in their arsenal to use to protect their sales and their profits. Let's talk about customary farming exemptions. For me, this is really the most important issue It's really why I wrote the book, and I think for many people who have turned to a plant-based diet, this is one of the main reasons behind their decision to do that. What are customary farming exemptions? These are exemptions that take a state's broad cruelty statute that prohibits cruelty to animals, and they carve out a small exemption for farm animals. And they say that the statute doesn't apply to farm animals. I want to give you an example of how this works. In Connecticut, in 1854, the legislature passed a very broad cruelty statute. It prohibited cruelty to any animal. You can't get any broader than that. And that's great. That statute was on the books for almost 150 years. In 1996, the Connecticut legislature adopted a customary farming exemption. I have this text memorized, but if I don't read it, you won't believe me. So I'm going to have to read it to you, okay? This is what the Connecticut legislature, this is what the Connecticut anti-cruelty statute says today. In Connecticut, it is legal to, quote, maliciously and intentionally maim, mutilate, torture, wound, or kill an animal, provided the act is done while following generally accepted agricultural practices, unquote. To paraphrase, it is legal to intentionally torture a farm animal. The second part of that statutory language, if it's done in accordance with generally accepted agricultural practices, here's what that means. If a group of farmers suddenly decides that they want to start cutting off a new part of an animal's body, with or without anesthetic, although invariably without, and there's an expedient or economic reason to do it, and enough of them start doing it, ear, legs, beak, tail, genitals, whatever, by definition, because a number of them are doing it, it becomes legal. It used to be illegal, and then a bunch of them started doing it, and they made it legal. That is how these statutes work. We have these statutes in 37 states. In the 13 states that don't have them, the same principle of law applies by virtue of judicial decision-making, or the common law. This practice essentially removes from state legislatures the authority to decide what constitutes animal cruelty, and it hands it to the animal food producers who are raising these animals. It says, yeah, you decide. If you think it's not cruel, well, we're okay with that. This isn't really any different, in my view, from letting nursing home operators decide what constitutes elder abuse. It's just crazy. It doesn't make any sense. What am I talking about when I talk about customary farming exemptions? The picture tells 1,000 words. Starting at the top left, it's legal in every state in this country to chop off virtually any part of an animal's body without anesthetic. Tail, ears, beak, genitals. Genitals can be either chopped off or crushed without anesthetic. Now, incidentally, it would cost about 25 cents to anesthetize an animal before castrating him. It doesn't seem like much money. I mean, you just pull out a quarter and pay it. But if you have 100,000 animals, that's $25,000. That's a lot of money. If you have 1 million animals, that's $250,000. So you can see that it adds up. Nobody's going to do something that the rest of the industry isn't required to do, because that's going to make them uncompetitive. Then they can't compete. They have to sell their products for more, and they're going to be outcompeted by the people who didn't spend the money on the anesthetic. So you can understand why nobody will voluntarily do something that they're not required to do in this industry. Top middle, in almost every state in the country, it's legal to confine sows in gestation crates. These are pregnant pigs who will spend the majority of their lives in a state of confinement where they basically can't move. A few states have actually outlawed this practice. Florida is one. California, where I'm from, is another one. Florida and California are not leading pork-producing states. So while it's nice, it doesn't really affect the fact that more than 95% of the pork raised in this country continues to come from animals raised like this. In almost every state in the country, it's legal to raise hens in battery cages. This means that a typical hen will spend her life in an area about 2/3 the size of a piece of paper, about like that. This practice has also been outlawed in a few states, including California. Again, California, not a major egg-producing state. So more than 95% of the eggs raised in this country continue to come from battery hens. Now, when I talk about customary farming exemptions, people often respond by saying, that sounds terrible, but in my case, I get all of my fill in the blank from fill in the blank. So this isn't going on with my food. Fill in the blank. I get all of my pork is organic. All of my eggs are cage-free. All of my beef is grass-fed. It doesn't matter. 98 to 99% of all of the animal foods consumed in this country come from factory farms. We know this statistically. These bottom three slides are images of cage-free hen production. Bottom left, it's about 100,000 hens in a dark, windowless shed where they'll spend their entire lives. They'll be debeaked, as you see in the bottom right, which means they'll have a third to half of their beak removed. It's a painful procedure. It leaves them in chronic pain with a stump neuroma or a fibrotic nerve ending because they use their beak to eat. Every time they eat for the rest of their life, it will hurt. And of course, male chicks don't lay eggs, so they're totally useless and irrelevant in this industry. And as the bottom middle slide shows, they can be disposed of in any way that is convenient and expedient. They could be dumped into garbage cans and left to starve or freeze to death. They can be thrown in wood chippers or meat grinders. Farmers don't engage in these behaviors because they want to be cruel. Nobody really sets out and says, I'm going to see how cruel I can be. What is going on is economic pressures force people to do this stuff. A chicken is only worth about $3. That's the replacement value of a chicken. If you're a farmer and your chicken has a prolapsed uterus, you're not going to call a vet and spend $30, $40, $50 to treat that condition. You're going to pick that chicken up and throw her in the garbage. It's not cruel. It sounds cruel to us, but it's not intentionally cruel. That is economic reality. The only way to change producer behavior is to change the way the law applies to them. Now, when states fail to act to protect the disadvantaged, the disenfranchised, the challenged, often the federal government steps in. Because here we're talking about state laws, you might think, well, maybe the federal government has nobly come to the rescue of farm animals. The federal government has introduced is responsible for a lot of great laws over the years, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, etc. Unfortunately, the federal government has not done much in this area. The most important federal statute, as far as animals are concerned, is the Animal Welfare Act, which specifically does not apply to animals raised for food. So we can ignore it. There's something called the 28-hour law. This law says that when animals are being transported across state lines, if the trip takes more than 28 hours, the driver has to stop, offload the animals, and give them a chance to rest and to have food and water. First of all, if that sounds humane to you, ask yourself this question. How many times in your life have you been denied food, water, and rest for 28 hours? Probably never. More importantly, this law has so many exceptions and loopholes that is practically speaking completely ineffective. First of all, it doesn't apply to chickens or turkeys, which constitute roughly 98% of the animals raised for food in this country. It doesn't apply to intra-state trips. You have to cross a state line. If you just travel the length of Florida or California or Texas, even though you drive for several days, this law doesn't apply. The maximum penalty is $650. A slap on the wrist. It doesn't apply if the driver can show that he couldn't avoid violating the law, quote, when being careful. That is actually what the statute says. If the driver can just say, look, I was being careful, I couldn't avoid violating the law doesn't apply. Because of all these crazy loopholes, An animal rights group was interested a few years ago to know whether this law is actually enforced at all. They presented a request under the Freedom of Information Act to the USDA and the United States Department of Justice, and they asked, in the last 50 years, have you enforced or attempted to enforce the 28-hour law? And in both cases, USDA and US DOJ, the answer is no. This law is never enforced. Completely irrelevant. And here's the final gem in the federal legislation category. The Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. This act says that before an animal is slaughtered, he or she must be rendered insensible to pain. That means stunned. In this photo, that's a bolt gun stunning that animal. Again, lots of exceptions. It doesn't apply to chickens or turkeys, which again constitute 98% of the animals raised for food in this country. Turkeys and chickens are routinely killed by just having their throats slit and being left to bleed out. This statute also doesn't apply at all during an animal's lifetime. It applies only in the final instant of the animal's life, only the last few seconds when the animal is about to be killed. So the state and federal protections for farm animals are so completely insufficient that a couple of lawyers who wrote about this a few years ago, David Wolfson and Marianne Sullivan, you may know Marianne as the New York lawyer who is co-host of the Our Hen House podcast, they said, farm animals have no legal protection at all. As far as the law is concerned, they simply do not exist.